we'll start with this whole concept, and most of you know about this, but I want to kind of summarize and give you a heads up as far as the genetics of dementia and Alzheimer's in particular, and other diseases. All diseases have genetic components. I want people to know that and by genetics, what we mean is the kind of factors that make the likelihood of a disease becoming more prevalent or more increasing the risk of the disease, either directly or indirectly. Directly means that the gene is directly causing a genetic a process that leads to an outcome, like Huntington's disease. There's a locus on chromosome 4 that's aberrant, abnormal, and it creates this repeats, CAG repeats. CAG, each of those letters stand for a particular gene codes. For those of you who know or don't know, the way it works, genes have these cytosine, adenine, guanine, and thymine. That's the DNA, and those patterns alternate, change. It's CAG, and so on and so forth. And each of those codons, those 3 letters, actually gets transcribed into RNA, and then RNA is created, transcribed into amino acids. And each of those codons specifically mean a particular thing as far as protein outcome. With Huntington's disease, what's interesting is that one element, or one locus in the gene, creates the CAG repeats, which then becomes toxic and creates an incredible downstream destruction in the brain, which starts with some behavioral disorders. But by the time we see the patient, if they haven't figured out the genetic component early on, by the time we find out, the brain has been devastated. Big holes. You see shrinkage, all kinds of stuff. And from behavior, then it becomes abnormal movements with his dystonias and dyskinesias. And then from there, it's for dementia and death. Very rapidly in their 30s and definitely by early 40s. And there are a lot of other diseases like that, single focus gene effect. And that's a direct damage as a result of that gene. Others cause damage because they have abnormal function as far as its response to inflammation, or not too much, or not enough inflammatory response in disease process, or too much inflammatory response, which is the autoimmune diseases. And I'm simplifying that. Or getting rid of waste in the body. Yeah. That's a big problem. Getting rid of waste, and we'll have a whole conversation about that. And one of the only ways that we know that aging is reduced is by not creating enough waste, either by not eating a lot, which is the only thing that we've found that slows down aging, which is a calorie deficit. Or if you're going to eat the kind of food that doesn't create a lot of waste products because of its toxicity, abnormality, or because it doesn't have a lot of burn. And so inflammatory problems. And then the other one is lipids. So when you look at the Alzheimer's spectrum of how the disease happens, the gene-driven component, which means the gene is causing the outcome, and that's the whole amyloid hypothesis came from that, is only 3%, 3 to 4% of the disease. There are 3 genes that are driven by that kind of, or cause that kind of a problem: a presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and an APP. And the reason is this normal transmembrane protein, which traverses the membrane, is cut in the wrong place, and it creates amyloid. Right. And then downstream, it creates tau, or consequently, there's tau production as well. And that creates toxicity and damage and inflammation and too much inflammation, and the whole cascade follows. Now, that's only 3 to 4%. What about the rest? The rest are those other kind of genes, which is lifestyle factors, which is your inflammatory response is not as good. Right. Or you can't get rid of the waste, or you can't deal with glucose metabolism very well, or methylation and glycosylation, which is an aging process, is affected in different levels. We all have deficits in our gene responses, and in the future, maybe we'll be able to do something about it. But right now, what will affect that is our lifestyle in a very blunt, subtle way. The biggest one of those is APOE4.
That's right. Yes.
And that's the one that accounts for more than 50% of Alzheimer's. And APOE4 is part of a family apolipoprotein components. There's APOE2, APOE3, APOE4, and then there's a whole slew of others.
It's so fascinating to see that the apolipoproteins, they're essentially, there's almost an evolutionary change in how apolipoprotein is expressed in our bodies. And when you look at the literature, these are found in all kinds of animals too,
yes,
primarily in aquatic animal and land-dwelling vertebrates. Interestingly, it's not found in birds. It's found in crocodiles, but not in birds. And they are thinking about, the reason why birds don't have a really good mechanism of metabolizing cholesterol, or cholesterol doesn't really affect their body as much as it does for mammals, is because of the lack of APOE lipoproteins. So I was actually kind of going into a rabbit hole of understanding the history behind it and how we actually started understanding this better. But like you mentioned, the amyloid hypotheses and the tau hypotheses and how that drives Alzheimer's disease, we now know the impact, the profound impact of apolipoproteins on the body and how it actually, changes things as far as development of Alzheimer's disease is concerned. We've learned quite a bit. Now, maybe we can actually start by just giving a little bit of description of how ApoE, the different types of ApoEs actually interact with each other, and what are they responsible for?
Yeah, so APOE2, APOE3, and APOE4. So APOE2, from a 20,000-foot perspective, when you look at population studies, APOE2s seem to be protective.
That's right.
Well, for generally speaking, there are some varieties that cause lipid abnormalities as well, but for totality, APOE2s have a significantly lower risk of dementia.
That's right.
In fact, a significant lower risk of cardiovascular disease as well.
Now, maybe I should actually start questioning here as well, because it's relevant. So if someone has a copy of APOE2, and we know that APOE4 increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease, is the APOE2 protective? Does that actually negate the harm of having APOE4?
There seems to be some element of that, yes. So if you have one copy of APOE2 and then one copy of APOE4, which we will talk about the APOE4's risk, there seems to be a cancellation. In fact, the APOE2 seems to be pretty strong as far as its protective effect. And here's I'm going to titillate you guys, because some of you might have heard some of this stuff. Our view has changed with data a little bit, in the sense that up to recently, we thought that there was absolutely no value outside of research of doing genetic testing. But there is some evidence, again, it's not strong evidence, that maybe knowing your ApoE status will actually have consequences as far as how diligent you will be with lifestyle, but even with supplements. And we'll get to that. That should keep you for the rest of the conversation. So I just threw it in, and you just have to stay till the end to hear it. But it's really interesting, and we're doing the genetic testing for ourselves, and it has consequences as far as even supplementation and things of that nature.
All right. The different versions of ApoE are ApoE2, ApoE3, and ApoE4.
Correct.
And there's a rare ApoE1 as well, which we really don't know how it works.
Yes.
And it is so rare that we don't have enough people to actually study it in. And like you said, the ApoE3, let's talk about ApoE3. We talked about the protective effect of ApoE2. ApoE3 version becomes, it is probably the most dominant version.
Yeah.
And I think it's, according to data, it says that it is dominant because individuals with that version had longer and healthier lives. And so it benefited their offsprings. And so you see ApoE3 more in human population.
That's a great point, because most of the time we think that if we have an abnormal gene, it was an error and it just stayed with us. It served a purpose. Most of the time it served a purpose. For example, sickle cell. Sickle cell anemia, which is a disorder found in African Americans or in Africa as well, is a disorder where the red blood cells actually sickle, become abnormal. And it causes significant pain and sometimes infarcting in the ends of the vessels. and sometimes even strokes. And it's such a painful thing to see. And it's actually, again, a single gene disorder that can be potentially fixed. But why would so many people suffer from sickle cell? Well, it serves a purpose, because in Africa, it's presumed, because there was a lot of malaria, this actually protected individuals from death from malaria. The number one cause of death in the world was malaria, and still is malaria. Mm-hmm. And so it protected people because the malarial larva would not survive in these conditions.
Right.
So the person would suffer from sickling, but then yet they would still survive from malaria. Exactly. So it served a purpose. And all of these genes, even the ones that in today's world seem aberrant, served their purpose during their evolution.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as a matter of fact, there's data, and there were actually some papers that we came across that said, it's hypotheses that APOE4 is specifically, it plays a very important role in immune function. Yes. When infections were a significant threat to humanity. And the research on Somali people, Somali people have APOE4, the highest percentage of APOE4.
Yes.
But they also have the lowest prevalence of Alzheimer's disease. And they suggested that APOE4 may have helped them preserve their cognitive function during high parasite burden compared to those who had APOE3. So you see these populations that have, higher prevalence of a particular type of APOE4, and that's why you get to see particular patterns of diseases in that population too.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
So definitely the natural selection had a role in it as well.
Just as a little summary, that I wanted to actually go over this, the genetic component. You have the single gene disorders, which I talked about, which is Huntington's disease. Duchenne's muscular dystrophy is a single cell caused by a mutation in the DMD gene, particular place. Sickle cell anemia, we talked about it. And then cystic fibrosis. Then you have the multi-gene or complex disorders. These diseases are influenced by variation in multiple genes working together, and things like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, breast cancer, where BRCA1 and BRCA2 are involved with other genes. Then you have chromosomal disorders, and those are massive disorders. One of the common ones is Down syndrome, where you have, instead of 2 copies of chromosome 21, you have 3 copies. By the way, people with Down syndrome also have much higher risk of dementia and Alzheimer's as they get older, in their 40s and 50s. Why? Because APP, which is this transmembrane protein, is on chromosome 21. Mm-hmm. So triple copies, more risk of disease.
That's right.
And then you have mitochondrial disorders, which are very, very unusual. Remember, in our boards, those are the ones that gets us. They have the red fiber abnormalities, eye abnormalities, muscle abnormalities, energy abnormalies, like MELAS, Kern-Sayers, and mitochondrial. And then we talked about the epigenetic phenomenon, which is the Rett syndrome and certain types of cancer, and Alzheimer's. And the epigenetics, which is a bigger category, I wanted to kind of characterize so people can see the differential, the genetic, the distribution and manifestation. Alzheimer's is mostly an epigenetic phenomenon. Yeah. We would say more than 90%. That's where we came up with this extrapolation that under perfectly ideal conditions, which is impossible, but more than 90% of Alzheimer's could be prevented, not reversed, prevented. So, and because it's epigenetic.
Absolutely.
So we can go into the APOE3. So APOE3, on the other hand, is a wash. Mm-hmm. It doesn't increase risk or decrease risk. It's much less risk than APOE4, and slightly greater risk than APOE2. Yeah. And it's a very fairly common allele as well.
Right. All right. So let's talk about. I would like to actually go into the details of how this all is created. How does it come into being? We discussed the different versions of APOE4. Now, there are different types of cells in the brain that produce ApoEs or apolipoproteins.
Correct.
But the dominant one that produces are the astrocytes. But you can actually see microglia and oligodendrocytes and some neurons creating apolipoproteins as well. And these are made in the endoplasmic reticulum. They're processed in the Golgi apparatus, and then they're extruded outside of the cell. And essentially, what they are supposed to do is they're supposed to be carriers for cholesterol molecule. And then at times it gets glycosylated, which means a glucose molecule actually gets attached to it as well. And it's between the interaction of how much cholesterol it carries, how it gets glycosylated by a glucose molecule, is how it affects our vascular health and how it affects the process of getting rid of abnormal proteins for our body, aka the process of Alzheimer's disease and amyloid deposition, etc. That's where the process is actually affected. And so as far as functionality is concerned, it seems that APOE4 is just not good enough to carry cholesterol and remove cholesterol from the circulation. It's, just basically the black sheep of apolipoproteins. APOE2 does a good job. APOE3 is a wash, but APOE4 doesn't really do a very good job.
It doesn't.
And going into some of the details, we basically have studies that have looked at specific types of receptors that APOE4 binds to. We've actually looked at the process of glycosylation. We've actually looked at multiple different conditions, whether it's insulin resistance or diabetes or high blood pressure, and how that interacts with APOE4. And we've come to a conclusion based on the evidence that we have is that when people have a copy of APOE4 or 2 copies of APOE4, they are at a higher risk of having trouble keeping their arteries healthy.
And it's not just Alzheimer's. It's vascular diseases across the board as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And at the same time, there are certain things that actually helps APOE4 do a better job. For example, we have studies that show us that when people exercise and when brain-derived neurotrophic factor is created, they essentially stimulate specific receptors in our liver, which is called liver X receptor, LXR.
Yeah.
They stimulate these receptors in the liver to increase apolipoprotein production, so you have more of it, and it actually grabs onto the cholesterol and removes it by different cells, and especially by astrocytes in our brain.
Exactly.
So when you exercise, you actually create more receptors, the very thing that Apolipoprotein E4 doesn't do very well. So yeah, it's not all doom and gloom.
No.
And when we say that when you have Apolipoprotein E4, 50% of the population never develop any Alzheimer's disease. Why? Because they have created these internal mechanisms to fight against the lack of capacity or the inability of apolipoprotein E4 to do a good job.
And here's some more on that titillation that I said earlier. Transport of omega-3s across the blood-brain barrier through the MFSD2A receptor is affected or is different for APOE4 versus APOE2. And remember that the most important fat for your brain, if the only important fat, are omega-3, specifically DHA and EPA, specifically DHA more than any, but definitely both of them. And this receptor is affected by that omega-3. And by the way, exercise and other things that we'll talk about also affects the receptor prevalence in the blood-brain barrier.
It's fascinating.
Really?
It's fascinating. So not only does it not do a good job, it actually affects other things
across the board
too, and it makes them not do a better job.
Correct.
There's another receptor that I was studying. It's called the ATP binding cassette transporter, ABCA1. It's a long acronym, but essentially these are receptors that are on our cell membranes. And they're involved in so many different things, but one of the important jobs that they have is they help cholesterol go in and out of the cell, right? So APOE4 makes this ABCA receptor, it basically just nullifies its effect. It doesn't let it help transport cholesterol out of the cell. And when there's a lot of cholesterol inside the cell, it starts getting damaged.
Yes. Yeah. So the reason we're going into the depth of this, you're incredibly savvy population, then we want to kind of go into the nuance of these things. So when in social media, they just say, this is good, this is bad. And it doesn't only not satisfy the science, it doesn't do anything as far as the nuance that with which we have to approach this. The fact that how these things work, and the fact that APOE4 is not just for Alzheimer's, but for your vascular disease, and it's not just because of the its relationship with fat or lipids, but also with sugar and glycosylation as well.
Agreed.
It's the complex interplay of that. And then at the same time, when you are observant of those things, you significantly lower the detrimental effect of APOE4.
Exactly. Yeah.
Significantly.
Yeah. Fantastic. So before we go into the good news, let me kind of just go over some of the detrimental things that are seen in individuals who have APOE4. And I think we've already known that. We touched on it lightly. So increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, people who have APOE4.
By 12 times.
By 12 times.
If you have two genes.
Exactly.
And about 2% of the population have both genes, both two APOE4s.
Yeah. And about 15% of the population has one or two copies of APOE4. Is that correct?
Correct.
The number?
Yeah. Well, at least one.
At least one. Yes, absolutely. And then it also increases the risk of vascular impairment or vasculopathies, whether it's in our circulatory system or whether it's in the brain. It just affects how cholesterol metabolism occurs in our circulation, and it affects our endothelium, etc. So people who have APOE4 and they're not aware of it and they don't take care of themselves have a higher risk of having heart attacks, strokes, and mortality is higher as far as cardiovascular diseases are concerned. So that's been seen. It also, they also have a tendency of having immune issues. Immunity is affected significantly in individuals with APOE4. So they actually have higher levels of inflammatory markers. So high sensitivity CRP and their homocysteine and some other interleukin factors actually tend to be higher as well.
As you can see, this is why we're kind of leaning towards maybe knowing your APOE status, because it has consequences across the board.
Absolutely.
And it's not just a higher level of awareness and urgency, but also there is some now, just recently, some evidence that you can do something about it.
Absolutely. Can I actually mention a couple of other things as well in APOE4? There have been studies that it has some detrimental effects on the integrity of the blood-brain barrier. Yeah. So when blood-brain barrier integrity is affected, there's more deposition of heavy metals and things of that nature in the brain as well. And finally, it also impairs synaptic plasticity. So neuroplasticity, or the capacity of the neuron to make connections, seems to be lower in people who have not addressed their risk factors in the presence of APOE4. So it really does affect a lot of things across the board. All right, so that's what we know as far as their effect is concerned. And Skip agrees. He says, interesting that you should mention the motivational aspect of genetic testing. That's consistent with my own experience in that knowing my type, APOE4/4, has been an extremely powerful motivator. And that's absolutely true. So as far as let's jump in and talk about the vascular contribution to Alzheimer's disease is concerned. As you said, Dean, earlier, the amyloid and the tau hypotheses have been the main drivers of moving forward the research in Alzheimer's fields, and we've learned more about it. And all of these new medications that are coming out, they're targeting the amyloid protein or tau protein. But as far as the vascular contributions are concerned, there's multiple lines of different aspects of studies, whether it's clinical trials, whether it's observational studies for a very long time in populations well controlled for different confounding factors, shows us that when people have high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, or even insulin resistance, they're at a higher risk of having Alzheimer's disease as well. So in individuals with APOE4, those are the things that we can actually have control over. Let's talk about testing. So we've changed our minds about testing, and we would encourage people to know their APOE4 status.
I mean, it's not a must, but for those that are motivated and want to know, because a recent paper came out. By the way, our stance on a single paper. Even if it's the greatest paper, it has to be duplicated. It has to be done by somebody else, another party that has no connection and has no personal interest, to do the same thing and with the same outcomes. But the data showed that people with APOE4 actually do well at a much higher dose of omega-3. So, and that's not inconsequential, because not everybody can be on high dose of omega-3, and as far as treatment is concerned, that is an option that we must take into consideration. So if you have APOE4, then there appears to be, again, preliminary data. It will be repeated, hopefully, that they might have to be on a higher dose of omega-3. They have to keep a closer eye on their LDL cholesterol, at much greater level.
I wanted to add something with regards to omega-3. The reason the studies show us that people with APOE4, a copy or 2 copies of APOE4, need more omega-3 is because APOE4, it affects the transport of DHA into the cells. So so it actually affects the receptors. And more of it actually creates, or it's almost like a feedback mechanism where you actually have more receptors for it to be introduced into the cell. And one of the reasons why most of the studies in the past have failed in terms of why hasn't omega-3 supplementation not slowed down the process of cognitive decline or prevented cognitive decline in population was because the dose was quite low. And they never divided the population into APOE4 versus non-APOE4, but now we're doing that.
And in our own review, the biggest limitation was that the studies were not well designed as far as dosage and dose escalation was concerned. Exactly. And a lot of times in research, we failed studies because of inappropriate dosing.
Yeah, absolutely. So the latest studies have shown that typically people with APOE4 tend to do much better with at least 1 gram of DHA, which is the main, POE or polyunsaturated fatty acid in the brain. 57% of our brain is made of DHA. So it seems that a higher dose of closer to 1 gram or even more.
But here's the rub, though. This is not without consequence. So if you're going to go at a higher dose of gram or more, or even below that, you should definitely do this under the supervision of your physician, because some people have bleeding disorders. It's rare, but it's there. And they can have significant consequences. So be aware of side effects potentially, and do so under the supervision of your physician.
Exactly.
Or clinician.
And Saris is commenting here, actually questioning, and that's a very good question. She says, I was wondering whether we should all be following the advice directed for people who have the APOE4 gene, or would certain things be detrimental? For example, can you have too much EPA? I know that it can cause cardiovascular issues or atrial fibrillation if you have it in excess. Yeah. It would be really helpful to hear that.
That's why doing so under supervision of a clinician is important. The AFib story is actually, there was research that showed that, but it's actually not as prevalent. It should definitely be something to be in the back of your mind. But like I said, if you are being observed by your physician, not just for the AFib component, which is a smaller component, but for bleeding disorders and others, that should be taken into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're asking about specific venues that can do the testing. I think 23andMe is one of them, and you can actually get it done in the clinic under the supervision of a doctor as well if they're open to doing it. Right?
Correct. Yeah. Correct.
Some of them or some of them aren't. Unfortunately, it's not covered under insurance, so it would be an out-of-pocket pay.
Correct.
Right. So, so moving forward, we had this big hoopla about Chris Hemsworth, that one actor who was on a documentary on National Geographic's, and he publicly announced that he had APOE4 genes, and this whole conversation and this understanding of the APOE4's relationship with Alzheimer's disease kind of, it's so funny how Hollywood and, some TV shows actually blow up the concept, and everybody got really concerned. And we feel that there's been a lot of misinformation that has been spread along with that piece of information too. And coming to the preventive measures, when somebody comes back with a copy or 2 copies of APOE4, what should they do? Let's talk about that and clarify some misunderstandings. So yes, APOE4 does affect our cholesterol metabolism. and it is specifically LDL cholesterol. People who have APOE4 tend to have higher LDLs even during their midlife, and it continues to go higher and be uncontrolled as they age, because the aging process also affects our LDL metabolism. And it's incredibly important for different lifestyle measures, whether it's diet, exercise, stress management. All of those need to be instituted as early as possible. But at the same time, also have an open mind and room to discuss specific types of situations where lifestyle will not help people. Let's talk about diet. Now, as far as diet is concerned, cutting down saturated fats and making changes to lower LDL cholesterol is crucial.
Yeah, that goes across the board. Right. That's not questionable. Yeah.
And how is that done with diet alone? Well, specifically cutting out on sources of saturated fats that usually come from red meat, processed meats, high-fat dairy products, tropical oils such as coconut and palm oil. Those need to be reduced or eliminated as much as possible. Now, there's a little bit of, it's not a misunderstanding, but it's lack of very hard evidence around that. And Dean and I have been actually going back and forth, and he's been reading, and we've both been reading. So far, I think the understanding of adding polyunsaturated fatty acids to our diet when we have APOE4, that's questionable. There are some papers, and especially from Dr. Yassin's lab at USC, and he's been studying APOE4 and the effect of diet on it. It seems that when you increase your polyunsaturated fatty acid intake, which comes from nuts and seeds and extra virgin olive oil, the receptors that will help us reduce our LDL increases, because the impact that polyunsaturated fat has is very important. We have to maintain it. So cutting out all fat may not be the best thing to do. Yes, reduction of saturated fat is important, but also making sure that we consume polyunsaturated fat is important. So eating more nuts and seeds, avocados, and maybe perhaps even adding good quality extra virgin olive oil in our diet may be helpful.
Where we don't differ in this idea, but where we kind of are on the edges, my take on this, and I think yours as well in many ways, is that we haven't figured out the quantity of quantitative recommendations are not strong yet. And quantitative recommendation, given people's risks and epigenetics, is definitely not there yet. So we speak of that in humility. Science is a humble field, and when we don't know, we say we don't know. I mean, human tendency is to have certainty. We don't know certain things. We definitely don't agree with a lot of people that it's zero fat. Well, that there's no. I mean, to be honest, the data out there is just incredibly weak. We've gone over that many times, and we'll go over it many other times. But how much is a complex and for a piece of information that needs to be better elucidated, and it's being done. But at the minimum amounts of poly and monounsaturated fats is something that should be introduced. The upper end of it is not well known.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a conversation between a few nutritionists that are respectable, and they really know their field very well, and they were essentially saying that in cardiovascular diseases, and when you look at observational studies, it seems that saturated fats effect on LDL metabolism is so strong that making sure that you balance that with the addition of polyunsaturated fat is very important. So we'll know more about that, and hopefully we can actually go into an in-depth conversation about that balance between saturated and unsaturated fatty acids in a diet. And the reason why MIND and Mediterranean diet, even though it's not a low-fat diet, seems to be more beneficial compared to a diet that has no fat for Alzheimer's prevention is concerned. I mean, that also provides some level of evidence that inclusion of polyunsaturated fat is important in our diet.
The epigenetics of all this will be better elucidated at the age of where we are now, which is large data analysis.
Yeah.
So that's going to be done. The other thing is that the epigenetic phenomenon of understanding certain genes, the TREM1s, the APOE4s, and so many other epigenetic variable genes that are incredibly important for our health. We think that within the next 5 years, we'll be able to kind of personalize the genetic picture of a person's disease risk fairly clearly, and so that's kind of exciting as well.
It really is. All right, so let's talk about physical exercise.
Yes,
physical exercise effect on APOE4 has also been studied significantly, and as I mentioned earlier, in every way. As I mentioned earlier, it essentially, through BDNF and through some other vascular phenomenon, it affects how APOE4 metabolizes LDL cholesterol. And we all know that when people exercise, you actually metabolize LDL much better, and your LDL reduces significantly. So the combination of diet with exercise is a powerful way to reduce our risk of vascular diseases,
including the blood-brain barrier. The effect of exercise on the receptors of the blood-brain barrier is just remarkable.
Absolutely.
The fact that the availability of omega-3s in the brain, which is the most important fat, I'm going to keep saying that, is determined by how you exercise, because that affects the receptors, that affects the effect of recovery of the blood-brain barrier is just bewildering. Most of the time, we thought that exercise was just about getting the heart to beat faster so that there's more blood flow. But its effect of exercise is on BDNF, on receptors in the brain, on glucose receptors, on insulin receptors, on transmembrane receptors in the blood-brain barrier. Across the board, exercise is probably one of the most powerful tools you have.
Absolutely.
To improve all of those.
As a matter of fact, when we talk about delta or change from baseline, in populations who have APOE4, the change from baseline to improvement is always magnified compared to other APOE variants.
Correct.
So say, for example, if you separate a population into APOE4 variants versus APOE2 variants, and they're both exposed to the same intervention of, say, I'm just making up a study here, of diet and exercise, APOE4 populations will actually show more benefit, and they will slow down their cognitive decline more than APOE2 does, because of this massive effect of the change in vasculature and the change in LDL metabolism and the change in production of compounds that keep our arteries and our brain healthy ultimately, which is phenomenal. And you see this over and over again in multiple studies where the APOE4 population tend to benefit more from any intervention.
Which is incredibly, as Skip was talking because of his own personal story, incredibly motivating.
Exactly.
To know that not only do you have an influence, but you have much more of an influence because of your risk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because of the risk. You're
Correct.
Absolutely right.
We can ask some questions as well.
Absolutely. So we're going to go to the questions as well, and let's see. So as far as the type of test or the different companies are concerned, I think you can do your own research. Most of them are legitimate, I think.
Correct. Now, especially now.
Absolutely. And then Paula says, what is considered a higher dose of omega-3? I mean, as we suggested, as we discussed, up to 1 gram, and higher than that is considered good enough or appropriate. But of course, that needs to be made. You need to make a decision with the help of your physician or your healthcare provider to make sure that you don't have any other risk factors.
Correct.
All right. Let's see. So Skip actually is telling that he did the genealogy as well. It comes with different things. Clarissa says, I have APOE4. If one has APOE4 and is vegan, swims 1 to 2 miles a day, does strength training, gardened a lot of my produce year round, and takes lots of daily walks, long and short, with my dog, are those enough for quality of life?
From the data, from population-based data, it appears that is definitely the case. The effect of your lifestyle is significant when it comes to APOE4.
Right.
That's not always the case if you have, first of all, Huntington's is a rare disease. But if you have Huntington's, no matter what you do, you're not going to change the course. In this case, it's absolutely the opposite. Your lifestyle does have a significant consequence on outcome when it comes to APOE4.
So true. Skip says, speaking of Chris Hemsworth, what other recommendations he adopted do you believe make sense? For instance, I am not motivated to take a cold shower every day. That's very interesting that you mentioned that. We were going to talk about that. Sadly, there's really no evidence for cold showers. I mean, we went back and forth, and we've been holding ourselves to see why is it that humongous influencers and scientists that are on TikTok and on Instagram just keep on talking about ice baths and cold showers, and what is this cold exposure? Really no solid evidence. Have you come across anything, Dean?
No, it's the same logical fallacy where we take a concept that makes slight sense and we extrapolate it to its infinite possibilities. Mm-hmm. So the concept of hormesis, the idea that you challenge the body, and
small stress that doesn't make you sick, but challenges your body to become stronger.
Yeah, so that's the idea. So they take that concept and then they extrapolate from there. That's the problem with logic and TikTok logic or TikTok philosophy or TikTok science. There's incredible extrapolation. We're not against extrapolation as a first step of science, but not the last step of science. Agreed. In fact, even the last step of science, there's no such thing. That should be challenged, they should be repeated, and so on and so forth. But the idea of saunas and ice baths, yeah, there's some data, but it's weak data, and it's very myopic data, and it's a biased data. And then even beyond that, long-term data does not exist. Yeah. So there are these people who make these claims have difficulty accepting epidemiological population-based data that are incredibly well done in 600,000 and in Scandinavian countries or in United States, and Adventist Health Study or California Teacher Study, 100,000 people. They have difficulty taking data from populations like that. But when it's a soft data from a population in Finland that says ice baths or saunas, that makes sense to them. Why? Because it doesn't change their lifestyle too much from their eating patterns and all of that. It's a heroic act that's going to give you a big return. That's always been a driver, whether it's true or not. If you and ultimately, there's not much strong data. I was about to make a big claim, but before I got in trouble.
You're kind.
Yeah, throwing virgins into the fire. I guess I went there anyway. That was an incredible sacrifice. So it must have an outcome. Nope, it didn't.
And also, there are a lot of people, no, not even people. There are actually, the articles say that cold showers and cold exposure was associated with the feeling of vigor and energy and, improved mood. Just because something makes you feel good, I mean, right, go ahead and do it, but don't say that it's actually reducing your risk of any particular disease.
Prolonging your life.
A piece of cake makes me feel really good.
Yes,
but
it
it's
does.
not necessarily good for you. So.
But long term, though, there's no data. I mean, we're welcoming that, but there's no data. But the things that do work is significant exercise.
I think there's I forget his name. There's this gentleman who actually started this whole movement. Why am I forgetting his name? But Wim.
Oh, yeah. Iceman.
Yeah.
Wim Hof.
Yes, Wim Hof. And he has been, he volunteered to be studied, but that's an N of 1.
Correct.
So we need a larger population, and we need this to be replicated. For example, the Finnish study that showed that people who who do saunas on a regular basis have 65% lower risk of Alzheimer's dementia.
Yeah.
I mean, I would love for that to be replicated in San Bernardino.
Yeah.
Right. Only then we can actually tell and see whether it makes sense or not. All right. Holly says, is ADD or ADHD genetic, or is it considered epigenetic, whereas lifestyle can turn it on and off?
There seems to be greater data towards epigenetics.
Right.
Yeah.
Sandra says, do you know if decreasing saturated fat is recommended for lipoprotein A? So lipoprotein A is very difficult to lower. I mean, it definitely has a genetic underpinning. And it seems that diet doesn't really affect it significantly.
Yeah. So there were studies that showed niacin potentially, but that's not very strong, and not everybody can tolerate niacin. Diet might in particular cases, but we haven't figured out what those cases are. It's a very recalcitrant anomaly that has it's difficult to change. And by the way, the bad part is that it's also higher. It's been associated with a higher risk of cardiovascular disease.
Right. So basically, though in those situations, I think it's important to talk to a physician and keep LDL as low as possible. And a combination of some micronutrients and some statins actually, help people do better as far as their management is concerned.
And keeping an eye on your cardiovascular status, be it calcium score and things of that nature.
Yeah, I've spoken with a lot of my cardiology friends, and they basically say, we just leave it alone. And we try to focus on the things that we can control, which is LDL, blood pressure, glucose metabolism, etc. All right. Carol says, please define epigenetics.
Beautiful. So epigenetics, as the name implies, is anything that's an interplay between genes and environment. Anything that affects your genes and those genes that are amenable or interact with the environment as their final outcome. That's the softest definition of epigenetics.
Clarissa says, what blood tests are beneficial for vegans for dementia or Alzheimer's risk level per se? I think whether you're a vegan or not vegan, there are certain tests that need to be done on a regular basis. And I think we've shared that. They're vitamin B12, vitamin B6, B1, folic acid, vitamin D, and then markers of cholesterol and glucose metabolism. So there's a list of things that need to be checked. Yes, thyroid hormone lipids as well. Yeah. And you can find that in the homepage. Paula says, are there certain types of nuts and seeds that are better than others for purpose of adding polyunsaturated fats? Yes, I think alpha-linoleic acid and flax, hemp, and chia seeds seem to be very, very healthy. And beyond even their conversions to DHA and EPA, people who eat a lot of alpha-linoleic acid and the other compounds that are found in these seeds are incredibly healthy. One of the salient features of the Mediterranean diet was the fact that it was high in ALA. So flax, chia, hemp are great. Walnuts have been studied. Those are phenomenal. Walnut seems to be to have the highest amount of polyunsaturated fatty acids, more omega-3 than omega-6. So those are great. Bijan says, so you mean all my morning cold showers have been in vain? I have to say, I do feel really good afterwards. So is it all psychological?
Again, we said data. It could be more than that, but so far there's no data. And it's like, who says psychological is bad?
Yeah, that's true.
If you feel invigorated and fresh, and absolutely.
Yeah, great. Rita says, should we rather take a supplement that has exclusive DHA and no EPA so we don't get the negative effects of EPA? I don't think that there's negative effects of EPA. As a matter of fact, in cardiovascular diseases, the first supplement that was approved by FDA as a prescription medication was high doses of EPA.
Yeah.
They give high doses of EPA for people who have coronary calcium, who have vasculopathies, and it tends to reduce their risk of having heart attacks and strokes significantly. Not strokes, heart attacks only. So I don't think we should be concerned about EPA.
Yeah. But again, always, I'm going to repeat it. Always check with your physician and your own condition, your own situation.
Absolutely. All right. So when somebody comes in with a copy or 2 copies of APOE4 Dean in the clinic, I'm actually asking you so you can explore that. Mm-hmm. Does your management of the patient differ from someone who does not have APOE4?
Management of the patient, no. My conversation, of course, it has to change a little bit by telling them. It's almost like somebody who comes in with microvascular disease of the brain versus one who doesn't. With somebody who comes in with microvascular disease of the brain and say, you have risk. You already have, or with high blood pressure for that matter. Right. You already have high blood pressure. You have microvascular disease in the brain. This can actually progress to become dementia. You have to have greater awareness. You have to be at greater observe your risk profiles, do everything necessary to reverse your risk or reduce your risk significantly. Same thing with APOE4. Not that I don't do it with APOE2. My sense of urgency and the language and the cadence and and the tone I use become a little more urgent in its take. And now I even talk about omega-3, saying you might need, if I know them well, if I know their bleeding status and all their blood biomarkers and everything else, I would say if you're not on omega-3, start taking omega-3, even if you're eating fish or whatever, take omega-3s, and if need be, even higher dose.
Absolutely. Okay. I hope that was helpful, Britta, because I know that you actually asked this question on the main page as well. So please type in whatever questions you have. Linda says, I live in Germany and it's not really talked about here. Are there standard genetic tests which include many or all health-related genes, or just tests for specific genes? What do I ask for? I don't think there's a panel of any sort, Linda, that looks at genetic risks for some of the more common diseases. I think you should ask for specific ones. And for this one, I think for as it relates to Alzheimer's disease and dementia, APOE4 would be a good one to ask for. Sandra says there's a large camp of professionals who think cholesterol is just fine and have all been deceived. Atherosclerosis isn't fat deposition. They are militant. Aren't the studies pretty conclusive? They are, Sandra. I think all of these large camps who think that having high cholesterol is fine, they're going to be irrelevant, because there's so much data that negates what they think. Mm-hmm. And I think they don't come from a place where evidence is important for them. It almost becomes a clan of some sort, like just a dogmatic way of thinking and then following that. Even, from people who essentially don't address their LDLs, and they continue to live that way. We don't hear about the switches later on, but they've actually come back and said like, oh, they had heart attacks, or they got so sick they almost died, and then they switched and they lowered the LDL and they got better. So we don't hear about those, but there are a lot of people who are becoming more and more aware, health aware, because of good data and because of good communication and more trust with healthcare providers.
Correct.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and answer Anne's question. Anne Caulfield on the main page said that, that her partner and my partner and I follow neuro as much as possible. And Michael, however, is showing some signs of memory challenges, her partner. And we wonder if there's a scan that can give some indication of his brain health, perhaps a test for the gene, maybe a clue. So Anne, I think it would be important for Michael to be evaluated for cognitive impairment, and it comes with its own set of tests.
Correct.
Do you want to talk about what that is?
Absolutely. So imaging, both MRI and if in there your insurance covers PET scan, neuropsychological testing, which is very important because even at the very early stage, it gives you not just a deficit across the board, but specific types of deficits that give you a window into what the problem could be. And then an assessment of him to see if he's the changes that he's experiencing. So those three factors are incredibly helpful. And of course, the biomarkers, which are what Aisha has been talking about, which is the B12s and the thyroids and the lipids and the hemoglobin A1Cs and the vitamin Ds. All of those are important because they can actually exacerbate even at the lower normal level. But the imaging and the neuropsychological testing is imperative. For those of you that know, we're starting the Brain Health Institute. So initially in 10 states and then nationally. So that's available. But other than that, you can see any doctor and they'll do the basic stuff. So yeah.
Rebecca, I'll come back to your question later because it's related to something else in the page. Britta says, can you explain gene therapy in which APOE4 homozygous genes are switched or turned into APOE4 and 2, 4 and 2, or 3-2 or 2-2? I read about a gene therapy trial for people 50 plus years old with APOE4. They want to replace one of the two APOE4 genes with an APOE2. However, I was wondering if artificially changing the gene really reduces the risk of Alzheimer's disease. And why would they only replace one and not both? I'm already following your lifestyle. And she mentions everything that she's doing.
So gene therapy is here. It will happen. It's not there in the market. And even if the people are purporting that it is, it's false. It's almost like that PRP. Everybody's doing PRP, but nobody's really doing PRP. So only in specific locations and specific situations are people doing PRP properly. Same thing with gene therapy. Gene therapy is not in the market. If it is, it's in the research labs and the clinical trials, and it's on single locus genes. And because it's experimental, they're making small changes to see effect. Always in medicine and research, do no harm precedes do good. That in our oath, that's the thing we talk about, which is do no harm first. So minimal effect, observing minimal effect to see if that's going to have an effect, change one gene or influence one gene, and then see where we can go from there. But we are in the precipice of a revolution of genetic modification that's going to be coming. I cannot wait. I don't care what people say. If they think they want to be natural, talk about natural to a person who's going through Huntington's. I cannot wait for us to do genetic engineering with Huntington's disease, with sickle cell, with many other diseases that are ALS, which are devastating people in populations, and including Alzheimer's, if we can alter certain genes to lower risk by 20%, 30%, and across the board. Absolutely. In the meantime, lifestyle will be incredibly helpful. And even afterwards, lifestyle will probably add to a final outcome.
Absolutely.
So that's where we are with the gene modification.
Absolutely.
And since we first heard about CRISPR, oh my goodness, the field has moved ahead so far and has become so much more efficient, and we're very optimistic of its outcomes within the next decade or so.
Absolutely. And that's a wrap. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to stay up to date with future episodes, please subscribe and follow our podcast on Apple or Spotify, and watch the recordings on our YouTube channel. We would appreciate you supporting this show with your review, as it helps it reach more people. We look forward to connecting again in the next episode.